I have a brother named 𝚜𝚘𝚎, who is 4 years older than me. We live with our parents in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. There's not a lot of space, so my brother and I have to share a room. We have bunk beds. I sleep on the bottom bunk and my brother sleeps on the top. One night, my parents went to visit our relatives who live in the country. I stayed out late with my friends. When I got home, it was already past midnight. I didn't want to wake my brother, so I didn't turn on the light. I just undressed in the hallway and went into our room. As I was getting into bed, I heard my brother groan and ask for a drink of water. I went to the kitchen, filled up a glass with water. When I returned to our bedroom, I sat down on the bottom bunk, took a couple of sips, then handed the glass to my brother. He took it from my hand. "Good night," I said, and I climbed into bed. I fell asleep almost instantly. Some time later, I was awoken by the sound of knocking. With difficulty, I opened my eyes. It was still dark. I looked at the clock. It was after 6 a.m. Who could be coming to visit so early? I thought. I yawned, pulled myself out of bed and went to open the door. There stood my brother. "Where were you?" I asked. "I stayed the night in my girlfriend's place," he replied. Suddenly I understood the meaning of his words. "You didn't come home last night?" I asked. "No," my brother said. With a pounding heart, I walked back to the bedroom and turned on the light. The top bunk was empty and beside the pillow, there was an empty glass. A few years ago, I traveled to South Korea to teach English. I was living in an apartment which I shared with 2 Korean girls named 𝚑𝚑𝚎𝚑 and 𝚠𝚑𝚎. One night, we went to a nightclub. The 2 girls and I had some drinks and danced for hours. At the end of the night, we decided to get a taxi home. Outside the nightclub, I waved at a yellow taxi that was passing by. It stopped and we got inside. I was sitting in the front seat and my 2 friends were sitting in the back seat. The taxi driver was an odd fellow. He spoke very good English and began telling us some jokes. He was actually quite funny and I found myself laughing at everything he said. When I glanced behind me, I noticed that 𝚑𝚑𝚎 and 𝚠𝚑𝚎 were not laughing at all. In fact, they were sitting there, stone-faced, with a really odd expression on their faces. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Why aren't you laughing?" They wouldn't answer me. Instead, they sat there in the back seat, staring straight ahead. Suddenly, 𝚠𝚎 leaned forward and said something to the taxi driver in Korean. He pulled over to the side of the road, and the 2 girls got out of the yellow taxi and started walking away quickly. I was puzzled. This wasn't our stop. In fact, we were nowhere near our apartment. I paid the driver and ran after the 2 girls. "What's the matter?" I asked when I caught up with them. They turned to me, their faces white with fear. "We have to call the police," said 𝚠𝚎. "Didn't you hear it?" said 𝚑𝚑𝚎, coming from the trunk of the taxi. A woman's voice saying, "Please help me. Please help me." One night, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah was babysitting 3 children for the Peterson family. They always hired her because the kids really seemed to like her. The parents were going out for dinner and a movie and asked to take good care of the kid. She gladly accepted, as she loved the Peterson kids very much. They were very enthusiastic yet always listened to her, which made them easy to babysit. After the parents left, she asked the kids if they wanted to watch TV. While the kids were mesmerized by the cartoons, the screen suddenly went black and red letters scrolled down the screen. The message read, "An emergency has been declared. Murderer Zachary Whitman has escaped from Alcatraz prison. He is extremely dangerous and is armed with a blunt hatchet. He is 6'6", with spiky hair and a raspy voice. You are advised to lock all doors and windows and take every precaution. The police are currently searching for him, but have not received any sightings. Thank you and good night." The kids started to panic because they lived on Lombard Street. which was not far from the island of Alcatraz. Sarah was a little uneasy too. In order to keep the kids calm, she told them to go to bed. After the kids were asleep, she decided it would be best to watch the news in case they gave any updates on the murderer. After about 15 minutes, a news bulletin came up. The announcer said, "Crazed murderer Zachary Whitman has been spotted on Lombard Street. Residents are advised to take every precaution in order to keep their house secure." Now Sarah started to get really worried. She pushed the glass coffee table in front of the door. She still kept the news on in case there were any more updates on his location. About 15 minutes later, there was another news bulletin. It has been confirmed that the entire Farmer family has been killed. Sarah didn't even listen to the rest. She knew that the farmers were the neighbors with the naughty teenagers. She looked out the window. There were at least a dozen police cars on the street. She went up and checked on the kids to make sure they were okay. They were all fast asleep. Sarah checked every lock on the house to make sure they were secure. As she was closing the curtains, she saw that there was a police car outside. She watched them handcuff a tall man and shove him into the back seat. That must be the murderer, she thought. Just as the police were about to close the door, the tall man turned and looked straight at her, giving her an evil smile. A shiver went down Sarah's spine. Then, the police closed the door and the car drove away, out of sight. When the children's parents got home that night, Sarah was still a bit shaken. She told them all about the events of the night, and they insisted on driving her home. About halfway through the ride home, Mr. Peterson reached over and turned on the radio. There was another news bulletin. At first, Sarah thought it must be about the police capturing Zachary Whitman. Unfortunately, it was far, far worse. Reports say that the police car carrying Zachary Whitman back to Alcatraz has been found crashed on the side of the road. Both police officers were dead and each one had a clear incision down their torso. Zachary Whitman was not found in the car and is believed to have escaped to perpetrate another murder rampage. Mr. Peterson dropped her off at her apartment building, and as she went up in the elevator, her legs were shaking like jelly. "It's okay," she told herself. "The doorman wouldn't let a murdering psycho in, right?" Then she gave an uneasy chuckle. When she was about to enter her apartment, she noticed the door was a crack open. When she walked inside, everything was deathly quiet. Looking into her parents' bedroom, she saw two figures lying under the covers. "Mom, Dad," she called. There was no answer. When she pulled back the sheet, she was horrified to see that her parents had been hacked to death. Their bodies had been violently chopped into tiny pieces. Sarah started to cry. She loved her parents, and they were dead because of her. Just then, Sarah heard a noise behind her. She turned and saw a tall man with spiky hair, holding a bloody hatchet. In a raspy voice he said, "Time's up."